On the day of my husband and son's funeral, I kept staring at the chapel doors, hoping my parents would walk through them, but the seats I had reserved remained empty. Hours later, as I stood beside their freshly covered graves, my phone buzzed with a notification. There was my mother, father, and younger sister Charlotte, all smiling on a yacht in Monaco, champagne glasses raised high, celebrating Charlotte's engagement milestone with her wealthy fiancé. In that moment, something inside me died alongside David and Oliver. If my pain meant nothing to them, then from that day forward, neither would my loyalty. Before we dive into today's storytelling session, tell us where you are watching from and add like and subscribe to this section so we can continue bringing you these compelling narratives. My name is Emma Watson, 36 years old, a freelance graphic designer living in Portland, Oregon. If you were to look at my life from the outside, it probably wouldn't seem extraordinary, at least not before everything crumbled. I wasn't someone who chased fame or fortune. I simply wanted a warm home where I could return each evening to see David, my husband of 8 years, reading in his favorite armchair, and hear the joyful chatter of Oliver, our 6-year-old son, as he built elaborate Lego castles on our living room floor. For me, that was everything. David, 38, was the gentlest soul I'd ever known. A high school English teacher with an infectious passion for literature, he could make Shakespeare come alive for even the most reluctant teenager. He had this way of tilting his head when he listened, as if your words were the most important thing in the world. David wasn't just my husband, he was my anchor, the person who believed in me when I doubted myself, who celebrated my small victories as if they were grand achievements. And Oliver, our bright star. He was in first grade, at that magical age where every day brought new discoveries. His eyes, the same warm brown as David's, sparkled with curiosity about everything from why leaves change color to how airplanes stay in the sky. Every evening when I finished work, Oliver would run to me with drawings from school or stories about his best friend Marcus, chattering excitedly while David prepared dinner in the background. Those moments were pure gold. We lived in a cozy craftsman house in southeast Portland, nothing fancy but filled with love. There was a small garden where I grew herbs for cooking, and a reading nook by the window where the three of us would pile together on Sunday mornings with coffee, juice, and whatever book Oliver had chosen for the week. Our life was simple, but it was ours and it was beautiful. But to build this life, I traveled a long road from my childhood in Beverly Hills, California. I was born into what most would consider privilege. My father, Richard Watson, was a successful entertainment lawyer, and my mother, Victoria, worked as a high-end interior designer for celebrities. We had the big house, the expensive cars, the vacation homes, but wealth couldn't buy what I truly needed: my parents' attention and love. My younger sister Charlotte, 3 years my junior, was the family's golden child from birth. Beautiful, charismatic, and naturally gifted at manipulating people to get what she wanted, Charlotte seemed to cast a spell over our parents. She could do no wrong in their eyes, while I was just Emma, the quiet older daughter who preferred books to parties and design software to social climbing. I didn't hate Charlotte, she was my sister and I loved her despite everything. But I grew accustomed to being overlooked, to having my achievements dismissed while Charlotte's every minor accomplishment was celebrated as if she'd cured cancer. I told myself it was just their way, that maybe if I tried harder, achieved more, they'd notice me the way they noticed her. Deep down, I always held on to hope that one day they'd look at me with the same pride they reserved for Charlotte. I learned early to be self-reliant. At 18, I moved to Portland for college, studying graphic design at Portland State University. I paid my own way through a combination of student loans, part-time jobs, and scholarships I'd earned through my portfolio. The distance from my family felt like breathing fresh air for the first time. I could be myself without constant comparison to Charlotte. I met David during my junior year at a coffee shop near campus. He was grading papers, surrounded by empty coffee cups, looking overwhelmed but adorable. I was working on a design project at the next table when he looked up and asked if I had a pen he could borrow. That simple interaction led to a conversation about art, literature, and dreams that lasted until the cafe closed. For the first time in my life, someone saw me, really saw me, not as Charlotte's sister or Richard and Victoria's disappointing daughter, but as Emma, a person worth knowing and loving. We fell in love, got married 2 years after graduation, and had Oliver. My life, while not perfect, felt complete for the first time. I thought I'd escaped the shadow of my childhood, the feeling of never being enough for my own family. I was wrong. That Tuesday started like any other October morning in Portland. The autumn rain was gentle against our windows, and the air carried that crisp smell of fallen leaves. David was getting ready for school, humming while he made coffee, and Oliver was at the kitchen table eating cereal and telling us about the field trip his class was taking to the Oregon Zoo. "Mommy, will you pack my camera?" Oliver asked, his face bright with excitement. "I want to take pictures of the elephants to show you and Daddy." I kissed the top of his head, breathing in that little boy scent of shampoo and innocence. "Of course, sweetheart. Make sure you take one of the penguins for me." David grabbed his travel mug and kissed me goodbye, his hand lingering on my cheek. "Love you, Em. I'll pick up Oliver after the zoo and we'll stop for groceries on the way home." "Drive safe," I called after them, watching from the window as David's Honda Civic pulled out of our driveway, Oliver's small hand waving at me from the passenger window. It was the last time I would see them alive. That afternoon I was deep in work, designing a logo for a local bakery, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed David's school. I assumed he was calling to ask me to add something to the grocery list, but when I answered, it wasn't David's voice I heard. "Emma? This is Principal Martinez from Lincoln High School." Her voice was tight, strained in a way that made my stomach clench. "There's been an accident. David and Oliver, they were hit by a drunk driver on their way home from the zoo. They've been taken to Oregon Health and Science University Hospital." The words seemed to float around me without meaning. Accident. Drunk driver. Hospital. I heard myself asking questions. How bad? What happened? Are they okay? But Principal Martinez's responses felt muffled, as if I were underwater. "Emma, you need to get to the hospital right away," she said gently. "I'm so sorry." I don't remember the drive to the hospital. I don't remember parking or running through the emergency room doors. I only remember the antiseptic smell, the fluorescent lights, and the way the floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet as a doctor with kind eyes and tired scrubs approached me. "MRS Watson? I'm Dr. Rodriguez. I need to talk to you about your husband and son." The words that followed came in fragments. "Extensive injuries, did everything we could, didn't suffer, so sorry for your loss." My mind rejected each phrase, throwing them back like a body rejecting poison. This was wrong. This was a mistake. David was supposed to be grading papers tonight while Oliver built Lego towers and I worked on client projects in the background. "Can I see them?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Dr. Rodriguez nodded solemnly. "Of course. Take all the time you need." They led me down a corridor that seemed to stretch forever, each step heavier than the last. When the door opened, I saw them lying there so peacefully they could have been sleeping. David's reading glasses were still tucked in his shirt pocket. Oliver clutched his small digital camera, the one he'd been so excited to bring to the zoo. I collapsed into the chair between their beds, taking David's still warm hand in mine, reaching over to stroke Oliver's soft brown hair. The tears wouldn't come, the shock was too complete, the loss too enormous for my body to process. I just sat there, whispering apologies into the silence, promises I could no longer keep, love letters to two people who would never hear them. Despite the crushing grief, I knew I had to function. I had to plan funerals, make arrangements, honor David and Oliver in the way they deserved. I called friends, David's colleagues at the school, the parents of Oliver's classmates. They came immediately, tears, hugs, offers of help, people who understood that the world had just become a darker place. But most of all, I needed my parents. I needed my mother to hold me and tell me everything would be okay, even if we both knew it was a lie. I needed my father to handle the logistics I couldn't bear to think about. I needed Charlotte to sit with me in silence, the way only a sister can. I gathered every ounce of courage I had left and called my mother. "Mom, I said, my voice breaking despite my efforts to stay strong. David and Oliver, they're gone. There was an accident. The funeral is Saturday. Please, I need you here. There was a pause, then Victoria's voice, distant and distracted. Oh, Emma. How terrible. We'll try to make it, dear, but you know Charlotte's engagement party is this weekend. It's been planned for months. I heard laughter in the background, champagne glasses clinking. My father's voice carried over. Tell her we're proud of how strong she is. She'll get through this. The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone in disbelief. Try to make it? Charlotte's engagement party? I told myself they were in shock, that they didn't understand what I was telling them. Surely they would come. Surely they would choose their daughter's darkest hour over a party. But deep down, a cold dread settled in my stomach. I knew better. The days leading up to the funeral passed in a haze of arrangements and condolences. I chose caskets with the help of David's sister Sarah, who flew in from Seattle and barely left my side. Friends brought food I couldn't eat, helped with paperwork I couldn't focus on, and took care of details I couldn't bear to think about. I kept checking my phone, waiting for a call from my parents saying they were on their way. I imagined my mother holding me while I cried, my father giving one of his rare but powerful speeches about David's character and Oliver's bright future cut short. I pictured Charlotte setting aside her usual self-absorption to be there for me when I needed her most. But the phone stayed silent. The morning of the funeral arrived gray and drizzling, typical Portland October weather that seemed to match the heaviness in my chest. I stood in our bedroom, staring at the black dress Sarah had helped me pick out, the same dress I'd worn to David's school's award ceremonies, where I'd watched him receive recognition for his teaching excellence while Oliver clapped proudly from the audience. The funeral home filled slowly with people whose presence meant everything to me. David's colleagues from Lincoln High School, parents from Oliver's class, neighbors who had watched our little family grow over the years. They came with tears in their eyes, flowers in their hands, and stories about how David had touched their children's lives, how Oliver had brightened their days with his infectious curiosity. Sarah stood beside me at the entrance, greeting people and accepting condolences when I couldn't find words. David's parents, flying in from Minnesota despite his father's recent hip surgery, wrapped me in hugs that smelled like the Irish spring soap David had used, a reminder of the man I'd lost. But the 3 chairs in the front row, marked with small reserved signs reading "Watson Family," remained empty. As the service began, whispers started to ripple through the gathered mourners. I caught fragments. Where is her family? I don't understand their grandson and son-in-law. How could parents not come to something like this? Each whispered question was a knife twist in my chest. I wanted to explain, to defend them somehow, but I had no explanation that made sense. How do you tell people that your parents chose a party over your tragedy? How do you explain that you apparently matter so little to the people who brought you into this world? I had prepared a eulogy, spent hours writing about David's passion for teaching, about Oliver's boundless curiosity and kindness. But when I stood at the podium, looking out at all those caring faces and those 3 empty chairs, the words died in my throat. All I could manage was, "They were everything to me," before Sarah gently guided me back to my seat. Just when I thought I might collapse entirely, a hand touched my shoulder. I turned to see Uncle Thomas, my father's older brother, whom I hadn't seen since Christmas 3 years ago. He lived in Vancouver and rarely made it to family events, but there he was, his eyes red with grief, pulling me into a fierce hug. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," he whispered. "I came as soon as I heard. You shouldn't be alone for this." Uncle Thomas stayed by my side throughout the service, helped me greet people, and even said a few words about David and Oliver when I couldn't. His presence was a lifeline in an ocean of pain. After the service, as we stood beside the graves watching the last mourners leave, Uncle Thomas put his arm around me. "You deserved better than this, Emma," he said, his voice heavy with anger and sadness. "I don't know what's gotten into Richard and Victoria, but this is unforgivable." Later, over coffee at a nearby cafe, Uncle Thomas explained why he was there. He'd seen my Facebook post about the accident, a simple announcement that had taken me hours to write through my tears. He'd immediately booked a flight from Vancouver, not even thinking twice about the expense or the inconvenience. "Family shows up," he said simply. "Real family shows up when it matters." But even Uncle Thomas's kindness couldn't erase the betrayal burning in my chest. When I returned to our empty house, David's coffee mug still in the sink, Oliver's Lego castle still scattered on the living room floor, I felt the full weight of my parents' abandonment. I picked up my phone and scrolled through the messages of condolence from friends, from David's family, from people who barely knew us but cared enough to reach out. Then I saw a notification that made my blood run cold. It was a post on my mother's Instagram account. A photo of her, my father, and Charlotte on a yacht, the Mediterranean sun sparkling on the water behind them. They were all smiling, my father raising a champagne flute, my mother leaning against Charlotte, who wore an enormous diamond ring. The caption read, "Celebrating our Charlotte's engagement to Marcus Blackstone. Our family is complete. #blessed #family first #Monaco. Family first." The words burned into my retinas. Our family is complete. I stared at that photo for I don't know how long, my hands shaking as I held the phone. While I had stood beside David and Oliver's graves, while I had faced the darkest day of my life, they had been celebrating. Not only had they chosen not to come, they had chosen joy, chosen Charlotte, chosen champagne and yacht parties over their daughter's devastation. I called my mother immediately, my heart pounding with rage and disbelief. "Mom," I said when she answered, her voice bright and slightly tipsy. "I saw your post. You were in Monaco. While I buried my husband and son, you were celebrating Charlotte's engagement." There was a pause, then a sigh of annoyance. "Emma, don't be dramatic. Charlotte needed us. This engagement is incredibly important for her future. Marcus is from one of the most prominent families in California. Besides, being there wouldn't have brought David and Oliver back." "Wouldn't have brought them back?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Mom, they were your son-in-law and your grandson. I'm your daughter. I needed you." My father's voice came through the phone, stern and dismissive. "Emma, stop being selfish. Charlotte's happiness matters too. You've always been independent, you can handle this. Don't ruin your sister's moment with your grief." In the background, I heard Charlotte's laughter, loud and carefree. The sound of my sister enjoying herself while I sat in a house full of memories and loss. "My grief?" I whispered. "I lost my family and you're calling it my grief? What about David? What about Oliver? Didn't they mean anything to you?" "Of course they did," my mother said, but her tone was flat, rehearsed. "But life goes on, Emma. Charlotte's future is just beginning. You'll understand someday when you have something important to celebrate." I hung up without another word, my hands shaking with a rage so pure it scared me. Something important to celebrate? I had spent 6 years celebrating Oliver's drawings, his first steps, his questions about the world. I had celebrated David's small victories at school, his published poems, the way he made me laugh every single day. But apparently, none of that mattered compared to Charlotte's engagement to a rich man. The memories came flooding back then, all the times I'd been made to feel secondary, disposable, not quite worth their attention. I remembered being 7 years old, winning first place in a school art contest, only to have my excitement overshadowed because Charlotte had learned to ride a bike that same day. I remembered my high school graduation, where my parents spent the entire ceremony talking about Charlotte's upcoming audition for a modeling agency. I remembered my wedding, where my mother spent most of the reception networking with David's family instead of celebrating with me. I remembered being sick with pneumonia during college, calling home for comfort, only to be told that Charlotte had been accepted to USC and they were busy celebrating. I remembered every birthday cake that was really about Charlotte, every Christmas morning where her gifts towered over mine, every family photo where I was positioned slightly to the side, as if I were an afterthought. But this was different. This wasn't about favoritism or neglect, this was about basic human decency. This was about showing up when your child loses everything. And they had chosen not to just once, but twice, first by not coming to the funeral, then by celebrating while I grieved. 3 weeks later, while I was still learning how to breathe without David and Oliver, my parents and Charlotte delivered another blow, one that finally shattered whatever remained of my hope for redemption. I was sitting in David's reading chair, surrounded by sympathy cards I couldn't bear to open, when the doorbell rang. For a moment, hope fluttered in my chest. Maybe they had come to apologize, to explain, to finally be the family I needed. I opened the door to find all three of them standing there. My father looked uncomfortable, my mother wore her society smile, and Charlotte examined her manicured nails with the bored expression of someone forced to attend a tedious obligation. "Emma, we need to discuss something important," my father said without preamble, not even asking how I was doing or acknowledging the loss that had devastated my world. They came into the living room, David's space, Oliver's playground, and sat on the couch as if they belonged there. I remained standing, something about their presence feeling invasive and wrong. "Charlotte needs a substantial loan," my mother began without any pretense of sympathy or interest in my well-being. "Marcus's family expects a certain level of presentation. The wedding will cost at least $200,000, and then there's the house, the lifestyle she'll need to maintain. As her sister, we know you'll want to help her start this new chapter." I stared at her, unable to process what I was hearing. A loan? For Charlotte's wedding? 3 weeks after I'd buried my husband and son? "We know David had a good life insurance policy," my father added, his tone matter-of-fact. "And you'll be selling the house, of course, too big for just you now. Charlotte is family, Emma. This is what families do for each other." Charlotte finally looked up from her nails, fixing me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's really an investment in my future, Emma. Marcus's family has connections that could benefit all of us. And besides," she shrugged, "you don't really need all that money anymore. It's not like you have kids to put through college or anything." The casual cruelty of that last sentence hit me like a physical blow. Not like you have kids to put through college. As if Oliver's death was somehow convenient for their financial planning. "Oliver was 6 years old," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I just buried my son 3 weeks ago, and you want me to give you money for a party?" "It's not a party, it's a wedding," Charlotte corrected with an eye roll. "And honestly, Emma, you're being dramatic. Tragedy happens to everyone. At least you got to experience motherhood. Some of us are still building our lives." My mother nodded approvingly at Charlotte's response. "She's right, dear. You had your time with David and Oliver. Now it's Charlotte's turn to be happy. You wouldn't want to stand in the way of your sister's happiness, would you?" The words hung in the air between us, so shocking in their callousness that for a moment I wondered if I was having some kind of breakdown, if grief had made me hallucinate this conversation. But no, they were really here, really asking me to fund Charlotte's lifestyle with the insurance money from my dead husband and child, really suggesting that my time being happy was over and now it was Charlotte's turn. "Get out," I said quietly. "Emma, don't be unreasonable," my father started. "Get out," I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat with all the rage and pain I'd been holding back. "Get out of my house. Get out of my life. I never want to see any of you again." Charlotte stood up, smoothing down her designer dress. "Fine. But don't come crawling back to us when you realize how alone you are. Don't expect us to include you in family events anymore." "You haven't included me in anything that mattered for 36 years, I shot back. "Why would I expect you to start now?" They left without another word, and I slammed the door behind them so hard that Oliver's artwork fluttered on the refrigerator. I slid down against the door and finally, let myself cry, not just for David and Oliver, but for the family I'd never really had, for the love I'd spent decades trying to earn from people who were incapable of giving it. But in that moment of complete breakdown, something else happened. A clarity I'd never experienced before settled over me. I was done. Done begging for their approval, done accepting their scraps of affection, done pretending that blood relations meant anything when there was no love to back them up. I thought about what Uncle Thomas had said, family shows up. Real family shows up when it matters. My parents and Charlotte weren't family, they were strangers who happened to share my DNA. Real family was Uncle Thomas flying in from Vancouver. Real family was Sarah staying by my side through everything. Real family was David's parents calling every day to check on me, even in their own grief. Over the next few months, I began to rebuild my life without them. Uncle Thomas became a regular presence, calling weekly and visiting when he could. He helped me navigate the practical aspects of loss insurance claims, estate planning, the decision about whether to keep the house. Unlike my parents, he never made me feel like my grief was an inconvenience or that I should move on according to someone else's timeline. "Take all the time you need," he told me during one visit. "David and Oliver were your world. Rebuilding after losing your world doesn't happen overnight." Through Uncle Thomas, I reconnected with other relatives I'd lost touch with, cousins who remembered me fondly from childhood, an aunt who had always wondered why I'd become so distant from family gatherings. They welcomed me back with open arms, creating a chosen family that valued me for who I was, not who I could be useful to. I threw myself into my design work, finding solace in creating beauty from nothing. My portfolio grew as word spread about my talent and reliability. I started taking on bigger projects, corporate branding, website design, even some work for nonprofits that felt meaningful. The money from David's insurance policy went toward expanding my business and creating a scholarship fund at Lincoln High School in David and Oliver's memory. A year after the funeral, I made a decision that felt both scary and liberating. I legally changed my name from Emma Watson to Emma Thomas, taking Uncle Thomas's surname. It was a small gesture, but it felt like claiming my real family while shedding the one that had never truly claimed me. The scholarship fund grew, helping students who showed David's passion for literature and learning. Every year, I attended the award ceremony, watching young faces light up with the same joy I remembered seeing in Oliver's eyes. It didn't bring them back, but it honored their memory in a way that felt true to who they were. My parents and Charlotte continued their lives as if I had never existed. Through social media and occasional gossip from Beverly Hills acquaintances, I learned that Charlotte's marriage to Marcus had been as shallow and materialistic as expected. She spent her days shopping and posting Instagram photos of her privileged lifestyle, while my parents basked in the reflected glory of her wealthy connections. I felt nothing when I heard these updates, no satisfaction at imagining their emptiness, no anger at their continued selfishness. They had become irrelevant to my story, supporting characters I had written out of my own narrative. 2 years after David and Oliver's death, I was finally ready to sell the house. Not because I was trying to escape the memories, but because I was ready to create new ones. I found a smaller place in the same neighborhood, close enough to visit their graves regularly, but different enough to feel like a fresh start. Uncle Thomas helped me move, along with Sarah and her family, who had become like siblings to me. As we packed away David's books and Oliver's toys, I felt sadness but also gratitude. I had been loved completely by 2 extraordinary people, and that love would always be part of who I was. On moving day, I received an unexpected call from my mother. For a moment, hope flickered. Maybe distance and time had given her perspective. Maybe she was finally ready to acknowledge her failures and try to make amends. "Emma, I heard through the grapevine that you're moving," Victoria said, her voice carrying that familiar note of superficial concern. "I wanted to reach out because, well, Charlotte and Marcus are having some financial difficulties. His family's business had some setbacks, and they really could use that loan we discussed. I know it's been a while, but family is family, right?" I stood in my empty living room, surrounded by boxes and the echoes of laughter that would always live in these walls, and felt nothing but pity for this woman who had given birth to me, but had never learned to be a mother. "I don't have a family," I said calmly. "I had one once, David and Oliver. But they're gone. As for you, Charlotte and Dad, you made your choice a long time ago. Live with it." I hung up and blocked their numbers, finally cutting the last thread that had connected me to a past that had never served me. The new house was perfect, bright and airy, with a studio space for my design work and a garden where I could grow the herbs David had loved. Uncle Thomas helped me paint the walls, and Sarah's children filled the space with laughter during their visits. It felt like home in a way the old house never quite had after losing David and Oliver. My business continued to grow, and I found myself mentoring young designers, sharing the skills I'd learned through years of trial and error. Some of them reminded me of myself at their age, talented but uncertain, seeking validation from people who couldn't or wouldn't provide it. I tried to be for them what Uncle Thomas had been for me, a steady voice saying you are enough, you matter, your work has value. 5 years after the accident, I met someone. Dr. James Mitchell, a pediatric surgeon who understood loss in his own way, having lost his first wife to cancer several years before. Our relationship grew slowly, built on mutual respect and shared understanding of how precious and fragile happiness could be. He never tried to replace David or push me to move on faster than felt right. Instead, he simply walked beside me as I continued to heal. James and I married in Uncle Thomas's garden in Vancouver, surrounded by the family that had chosen me and whom I had chosen in return. It was a small ceremony, nothing like the extravagant affair my parents would have wanted, but it was perfect. As I exchanged vows with James, I felt David and Oliver's presence not as ghosts haunting my happiness, but as love supporting my new beginning. We decided not to have children together. At 41, I felt complete with the family we were building from relatives, friends, and the young designers I mentored. James had nephews and nieces who adored us, and we had each other. It was enough. It was more than enough. I never heard from my parents or Charlotte again after that final phone call. Through the social media accounts of mutual acquaintances, I learned that Charlotte's marriage had ended in a messy divorce, that my parents' finances had suffered from supporting her extravagant lifestyle, that they had moved to a smaller house and quieter social circle. I felt neither satisfaction nor sympathy at this news, just a distant acknowledgement that people who refuse to learn from their mistakes inevitably face consequences. The details of their downfall reached me gradually, like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't asked to solve. Charlotte's divorce from Marcus had been particularly ugly, involving accusations of infidelity on both sides and a bitter custody battle over assets. The prenuptial agreement Marcus's family had insisted upon left Charlotte with very little, and the lifestyle she had grown accustomed to evaporated overnight. My parents, who had financially overextended themselves to maintain Charlotte's image during her marriage, found themselves in serious debt. The Beverly Hills house they had been so proud of was quietly sold to avoid foreclosure, and they moved to a modest condo in a less prestigious part of Los Angeles. My father's law practice, which had suffered from his distraction during Charlotte's various crises, lost several major clients. But perhaps the most telling detail was what happened at my cousin Jennifer's wedding. Jennifer was Uncle Thomas's daughter, and through the family network, I heard about the uncomfortable scene my parents had caused. They had arrived expecting their usual treatment as respected family elders, only to find themselves seated at a table in the back with distant relatives who barely knew them. The slight hadn't been intentional. Jennifer had simply organized the seating based on how close she felt to each family member. Uncle Thomas, who had been instrumental in planning the wedding, sat at the family table. My parents' placement reflected the natural consequences of years of self-absorption and neglect of family relationships. According to my cousin Mark, who witnessed the scene, my mother had made increasingly desperate attempts to insert herself into conversations with more prominent guests, while my father complained loudly about the inappropriate seating arrangement. Charlotte, who had come as their guest after her divorce left her socially isolated, spent most of the reception taking selfies and posting about the family drama on social media. The contrast with how they had treated David and Oliver's funeral was striking. At Jennifer's wedding, they had demanded attention and recognition they hadn't earned. At my darkest hour, they hadn't even bothered to show up. The irony wasn't lost on the extended family, and the whispered conversations throughout the reception made their social isolation even more apparent. Uncle Thomas later told me that several relatives had asked him about my absence from the wedding. When he explained that I was in Portland, thriving in my career and happily remarried, the responses were telling. "Good for her," Aunt Linda had said. "After what they put her through, she deserves better than this family chaos." But the most significant revelation came from my cousin Sarah, not David's sister, but another relative on my father's side. She called me one evening about a year after the wedding, her voice filled with regret. "Emma, I need to apologize," she said. "For years I believed your parents' version of events. They made it sound like you had become difficult and ungrateful, like you had turned your back on the family for no reason. I should have reached out to you directly, should have known better." She went on to explain that the truth about my parents' behavior had gradually emerged through various family gatherings and conversations. The story of their absence from David and Oliver's funeral, their demands for money during my grief, their consistent favoritism toward Charlotte, it had all come to light as relatives compared notes and shared their own experiences. "What really opened my eyes was when Charlotte tried to borrow money from me last year," Sarah continued. "She used the exact same tactics I heard they used on you: guilt about family loyalty, implications that I was selfish for not helping, promises that it was just temporary. But when I said no, she turned vicious. Called me names, said terrible things about my children. That's when I realized what kind of people we were dealing with." This conversation led to reconnections with several relatives who had been manipulated by my parents' narrative over the years. Slowly, I began to rebuild relationships with extended family members who genuinely cared about me, separate from the toxic dynamics my parents had created. One of the most healing experiences was a visit from my great-aunt Helen, my grandmother's sister, who was now in her 80s. She flew out from Phoenix specifically to meet James and to see how I was doing. "Your grandmother would be so proud of you," she told me as we sat in my garden, sipping tea and watching James tend to the herb beds David had loved. "She always worried about how your parents treated you. She saw the favoritism, the way they made you feel small. But look at you now, you've built something beautiful from nothing." Aunt Helen shared stories about my grandmother that my parents had never told me, memories of a strong woman who had overcome her own share of family dysfunction. "She always said the most important thing was to surround yourself with people who see your worth," Aunt Helen said. "Not people who make you prove it over and over again." These reconnections filled gaps in my family history that I hadn't even realized existed. I learned about relatives who had struggled with similar family dynamics, who had found ways to break toxic cycles and create healthier relationships. I discovered talents and interests that ran in my family line: creativity, entrepreneurship, resilience, that had nothing to do with my parents' narrow definition of success. The most surprising reconnection came from my mother's side of the family. My maternal Aunt Rebecca, who had been estranged from my mother for decades due to some long-forgotten slight, reached out after hearing about my situation through the family grapevine. "I cut ties with Victoria years ago," she explained during our first phone call. "She was always so competitive, always had to be the center of attention. When I got engaged before she did, she threw such a fit at my engagement party that she ruined the whole evening. I finally realized I was better off without that kind of negativity in my life." Aunt Rebecca had built her own successful business, raised 3 wonderful children, and created a life filled with genuine relationships. Her story was both validation of my own experiences and proof that it was possible to thrive after cutting ties with toxic family members. "The hardest part," she told me, "was giving up the fantasy of who I wanted Victoria to be and accepting who she actually was. Once I did that, everything became clearer." These conversations helped me understand that my parents' behavior wasn't personal, it was a pattern they had repeated with multiple people throughout their lives. Anyone who didn't serve their immediate needs or reflect well on their image eventually got discarded or marginalized. Charlotte had simply been useful to them for longer because her lifestyle and choices aligned with their values. But even that protection was temporary, as Charlotte's divorce had shown. When she was no longer the golden child bringing prestige to the family name, my parents' support had wavered. The unconditional love and loyalty I had spent years trying to earn from them didn't exist, not for me and ultimately not for Charlotte either. This realization was both heartbreaking and liberating. Heartbreaking because it meant acknowledging that I had spent decades hoping for something that was never possible. Liberating because it meant I could finally stop trying and focus my energy on relationships that were actually reciprocal. The family I built with Uncle Thomas, Aunt Helen, Rebecca, and the various cousins and extended relatives who genuinely cared about me was smaller than the one I had been born into, but it was infinitely more loving and supportive. These were people who celebrated my successes without jealousy, who offered comfort during difficult times without conditions, who included me in their lives because they wanted to, not because they felt obligated to. James integrated seamlessly into this chosen family network. His own experiences with family dysfunction, his parents had struggled with alcoholism throughout his childhood, gave him a deep understanding of the importance of creating healthy relationships as an adult. Together, we hosted holiday dinners for our collection of relatives and friends, creating new traditions that honored the best parts of family while leaving behind the toxic elements. The most meaningful tradition we established was our annual memorial service for David and Oliver on the anniversary of their deaths. It began as a private moment of remembrance but grew over the years to include anyone who had been touched by their lives: former students of David's, parents from Oliver's school, friends and family members who had loved them. Uncle Thomas always flew in from Vancouver for this service, often bringing flowers from his garden. James would read one of David's favorite poems, and I would share a story about Oliver that captured his curiosity and joy. It became a celebration of life rather than just a mourning of loss, a way to keep their memory alive through love rather than grief. The 8th annual memorial service proved to be particularly transformative for me. As I stood before the gathered group of about 40 people, teachers, neighbors, extended family, and scholarship recipients, I realized how much my understanding of family had evolved since that devastating day when I had first lost David and Oliver. Looking out at these faces, I saw genuine love and support reflected back at me. There was Mrs. Henderson, Oliver's first-grade teacher, who still kept a photo of him on her desk and spoke about his infectious curiosity to new students each year. There was Tom Bradley, David's teaching colleague, who had implemented some of David's innovative literature curriculum ideas and credited him with improving his own teaching methods. Most significantly, there were several of my scholarship recipients who had graduated and built successful careers, coming back each year to honor the memory of the people whose legacy had helped change their lives. Maria Gonzalez brought her own daughter, now 5 years old, and told her about the teacher and little boy in heaven who had helped her become a teacher too. But it was during this particular service that something unexpected happened. As I was sharing a story about Oliver's fascination with astronomy, how he used to make James and me lie on the grass with him to look for constellations, a familiar voice called out from the back of the gathering. "That sounds just like him," the voice said, and I looked up to see Charlotte standing at the edge of the group, looking older and more worn than I remembered, but unmistakably my sister. The entire gathering turned to look at her, sensing the tension that suddenly filled the air. My first instinct was anger. How dare she intrude on this sacred space, this ceremony for people who had meant nothing to her when they were alive? But as I studied her face more carefully, I saw something I had never seen there before: genuine regret. After the service ended and most people had left, Charlotte approached me hesitantly. "Emma, could we talk?" James squeezed my hand supportively and whispered, "I'll be right over there if you need me." Uncle Thomas positioned himself nearby as well, ready to intervene if necessary. But something in Charlotte's demeanor told me this conversation would be different from our past encounters. "I know I have no right to be here," Charlotte began, her voice shaky. "I know I forfeited any claim to being your sister a long time ago. But I had to come because I need to tell you how sorry I am." I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or self-interest, the hallmarks of every previous interaction we'd had. But what I saw instead was genuine remorse and a brokenness that seemed to go beyond her recent divorce and financial troubles. "I've been going to therapy," she continued, not waiting for me to respond. "After the divorce, after losing everything, I had a complete breakdown. And through all the work I've been doing, I've had to face some really ugly truths about myself and about our family." She paused, wiping tears from her eyes. "I know this sounds pathetic, but I never really understood what I had done to you until I experienced betrayal myself. When Marcus left me for his secretary, when his family cut me off without a second thought, when I realized that all the relationships I thought were based on love were actually just about money and status, that's when I finally understood what I had put you through your whole life." I remained silent, letting her continue while processing this unexpected turn of events. I found out about the scholarship fund through the Portland State website, Charlotte said. When I read about what you've built, about the lives you've changed in David and Oliver's memory, I realized that while I've spent my entire adult life taking from people, you've spent yours giving to others. You became the person Mom and Dad always said I was, while I became exactly what they taught us both to be: selfish and shallow. The admission hung in the air between us, and I found myself genuinely surprised by its honesty. This was not the Charlotte I remembered, the golden child who had never been asked to examine her behavior or face consequences for her actions. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she continued. "I know what I did, what we all did on the day of David and Oliver's funeral, was unforgivable. I know that choosing Marcus's stupid engagement party over being there for you in your darkest hour was wrong. I know that demanding money from you while you were grieving was monstrous. I'm not here to make excuses or ask for another chance." "Then why are you here?" I asked quietly, speaking for the first time since she had arrived. "Because you deserved better from your family, and I want you to know that at least one person from that family finally understands how badly we failed you. You deserved parents who saw your worth, who supported your dreams, who showed up when you needed them most. You deserved a sister who celebrated your successes instead of competing with them, who stood by you instead of undermining you." She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "I also came to give you this. It's not much, just a few $1,000s, everything I could scrape together. I know it doesn't make up for anything, but I wanted to contribute to the scholarship fund. I wanted to do something, even something small, to honor David and Oliver's memory in the way you have." I took the envelope, still processing this completely unexpected encounter. The Charlotte I had grown up with would never have admitted fault, would never have sought to make amends without expecting something in return. "What happened to you?" I asked, not unkindly. This isn't who you used to be." Charlotte let out a bitter laugh. "Rock bottom happened to me. Losing everything, including my sense of who I was. My therapist says that sometimes we have to lose everything false before we can find anything real. I spent 33 years being exactly what Mom and Dad wanted me to be: beautiful, charming, focused on status and appearances. And it got me a marriage to a man who saw me as a trophy, friendships based on what I could provide, and a complete inability to form genuine connections with anyone." She looked toward the memorial plaques for David and Oliver, which were visible from where we stood. When I read about David online, about what an amazing teacher he was, how much his students loved him, I realized I had never even bothered to get to know him when he was alive. He was married to my sister for 8 years, and I saw him as nothing more than Emma's husband who wasn't rich enough to be interesting. I never asked him about his work, his dreams, his thoughts about anything. Same with Oliver, my own nephew, and I barely knew him because children weren't useful to my social climbing. The pain in her voice seemed genuine, and I found myself feeling something I never expected to feel toward Charlotte: pity. Not the condescending pity of someone looking down on another's misfortune, but the genuine sadness of recognizing wasted potential and unnecessary suffering. "I've cut ties with Mom and Dad," Charlotte continued. "Not out of anger, though there's plenty of that, but because I realized that staying connected to them means staying connected to the toxic patterns that ruined my life and destroyed our relationship. They're incapable of change, Emma. They'll go to their graves believing that they were good parents who just happened to have one ungrateful daughter." This revelation surprised me almost as much as Charlotte's presence here. "You cut ties with them?" 6 months ago. After my therapist helped me see how they had pitted us against each other our entire lives, how they had turned me into a narcissist and you into a scapegoat. I called them out on their treatment of you over the years, especially their behavior during your tragedy. Mom's response was to tell me I was being hysterical and that I should be grateful for all the support they had given me instead of criticizing their parenting. Charlotte shook her head sadly. "That's when I finally understood that you weren't the problem, Emma. You were never the problem. They needed someone to blame for their own inadequacies, someone to make Charlotte look better by comparison. And I was too selfish and ego-driven to see what they were doing to you." We stood in silence for several minutes, both lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Charlotte spoke again. I know this doesn't change anything between us. I know I don't have the right to expect forgiveness or a relationship with you. You've built a beautiful life without us, and you shouldn't have to risk that by letting toxic people back in, even if one of them claims to have changed. But I wanted you to know that someone from your biological family finally sees you for who you really are: strong, compassionate, talented, worthy of love and respect. I wanted you to know that David and Oliver were lucky to have you, not the other way around. And I wanted you to know that everything you've accomplished, your business, this scholarship fund, the family you've chosen, it's all incredible, and you should be proud of yourself. As Charlotte prepared to leave, she turned back one more time. I know this sounds strange, but would it be okay if I continued to follow the scholarship fund online? Not to contact you or insert myself into your life, but just to see the good you're doing in the world. It helps me remember what actually matters. I nodded, not sure what else to say. As she walked away, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: surprise, sadness, a small sense of closure, and oddly, a tiny flicker of hope that it wasn't too late for Charlotte to build something real in her own life. On what would have been Oliver's 12th birthday, I visited his and David's graves with James and Uncle Thomas. We brought balloons and left them flowers, sharing stories about the beautiful souls who had taught me what real love looked like. As we stood there in the gentle Portland rain, I realized that I was no longer that broken woman who had stood in the same spot 7 years earlier. I was Emma Thomas now, not because I had erased my past, but because I had chosen my future. I was a successful business owner, a loving wife, a mentor to young artists, and a daughter to the family members who had earned that title through their actions rather than their blood. David and Oliver would always be part of my story, the chapter that taught me about unconditional love and showed me what I deserved from the people in my life. My parents and Charlotte were also part of my story, the chapter that taught me about toxic relationships and showed me what I would no longer accept. But the story was mine now, and I was writing it with intention, surrounding myself with people who saw me, valued me, and showed up when it mattered. I had learned the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes the family you're born into isn't your real family, and sometimes losing everything is the only way to find out who you really are. As we walked away from the cemetery that day, James took my hand and Uncle Thomas walked beside us, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was exactly where I belonged, with exactly the people I belonged with. The pain would always be there. Love doesn't disappear just because the people you love do, but so would the strength I had found in rebuilding my life on my own terms. I was no longer waiting for anyone's approval or love. I had learned to give those things to myself, and to choose carefully who I allowed to share in the life I had created. It was a good life, built on real love and genuine connections, and it was mine. That night, I sat in my studio working on a new project, a series of illustrations for a children's book about finding family in unexpected places. As I drew, I thought about the young woman I had been, always trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it. I wished I could tell her that she was already enough, that she deserved better, that the love she was seeking would come, just not from where she expected it. But maybe that was okay. Maybe some lessons can only be learned through experience, through loss, through the slow and painful process of discovering who you really are when everything you thought you knew is stripped away. I finished the illustration I was working on, a little girl surrounded by flowers, reaching toward the sun, and smiled. Tomorrow I would start a new drawing, and the day after that another one. I would continue building this life I had chosen, one day, one choice, one act of self-love at a time. And somewhere I knew David and Oliver were proud of the woman I had become.